Right, so are you ready for this? We've had a ton of requests for a deep dive into the crisis in Myanmar, and wow, there's a lot to unpack here. We're going to be looking at the junta's brutal tactics, the kind of complicated role that China is playing, the devastating landmine situation, and the humanitarian crisis that's unfolding for all the displaced people, including the Rohingya. So get ready for some, I think, some surprising facts and some insights from our expert here. All of what we're discussing today comes from Mizzima Weekly. They're based in Prague, and they focus specifically on news from Myanmar. By the end of this deep dive, you will not only understand, I think, the complexities of this crisis, but you'll also be armed with the knowledge to be able to discuss it intelligently. So let's get started. Let's talk about the junta, because their hold on power is anything but stable, and they're resorting to some truly horrific tactics.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We've seen this surge in airstrikes, actually the highest number since the coup back in 2021. And it's not just airstrikes. They're increasingly relying on IEDs, landmines, and shelling. And these are indiscriminate weapons that are just devastating civilian populations.
It's just horrifying. And they're doing all of this while also trying to bolster their ranks, conscripting 5,000 soldiers per batch since April of this year. I mean, what does that tell you about the state of their army?
It suggests heavy losses on the battlefield and a steady stream of defections. Their control is slipping, and this desperate escalation violence is a clear sign of that.
And it's not just statistics and reports. There are real stories of just unimaginable brutality. One that really struck me was the airstrike on the Kachin church compound on November 15th. 7 children, just playing football. And 2 other civilians were killed. How do you even process something like that?
It really just underscores the junta's utter disregard for human life. This isn't just about maintaining control. It's about instilling fear and crushing any opposition, no matter the cost.
It's a terrifying reality. Now let's shift gears and talk about China's role in all of this. It's a complicated relationship, to say the least.
It is. China has walked a tightrope with Myanmar for a long time, trying to juggle economic and strategic interests. They've poured money into the country through the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, which is part of their massive Belt and Road initiative. We're liking major infrastructure projects, ports, pipelines, roads. But the ongoing conflict throws a huge wrench in their plans.
Right, because instability is bad for business. They need a stable Myanmar to protect their investments, but at the same time, they don't want to be seen as openly backing the junta.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting. China is now negotiating to deploy private military corporations, Chinese PMCs, into Myanmar.
Wait, really? That's a huge development. What's the thinking behind that?
Hey. On the surface, it's about protecting Chinese interests. But it raises a whole host of questions. Will these PMCs just defend Chinese projects, or will they actively engage in the conflict? How will this impact the already fragile balance between China, the junta, and the various ethnic armed groups?
It seems like such a risky move. On the one hand, they're pushing ethnic armed groups to make peace with the junta, but then they bring in their own private armies. It's like they don't trust the junta to actually control the situation.
That's a very astute observation. It does seem to reveal a lack of confidence in the junta's ability to stabilize the country, despite China's public displays of support for the regime.
So we've got a junta clinging to power through brutality. We've got China trying to secure its interests in this very volatile environment. And then there's the landmine issue, which is just adding another layer of horror to this whole situation.
Yeah, it's a hidden danger that's claiming lives every day. Myanmar had the highest number of landmine casualties in the world last year, with over 1,000 people killed or wounded.
And that number's probably much higher, considering how difficult it is to get accurate data from conflict zones. And it's important to remember that these weapons don't discriminate. They don't just disappear after the fighting stops. They continue to pose a threat to civilians, especially in areas with a lot of displaced people, for years and years to come.
It's a long-term threat that can hold back entire communities, making it incredibly difficult for them to rebuild and recover.
Mizzima Weekly highlighted a specific incident that I think really drives this point home. 2 men, 75 and 55 years old, were killed by junta artillery fire in Yawaringi village just a few days ago. It's a reminder that behind the statistics are real people, real families, real lives shattered by this conflict.
Absolutely. These stories are crucial because they humanize the crisis, reminding us of the profound cost of this conflict.
All right, let's move on to the humanitarian crisis, because it is a truly dire situation. We're talking about millions of internally displaced people and Rohingya refugees, many of them children, living in absolutely desperate conditions.
Yeah, the conflict has created a perfect storm, exacerbating existing vulnerabilities. Climate change is also playing a role, with events like Typhoon Yagi adding to the displacement and disrupting access to basic necessities.
The report from Mizzima Weekly about the fuel shortage in Kelly Township really brought this to light. The rumors that the junta was going to stop fuel distribution triggered panic buying and price gouging. It shows just how fragile daily life is for so many people in Myanmar.
It's a stark example of how easily things can unravel. People are living on a knife's edge, and even the smallest disruption can have devastating consequences.
And then we have the Rohingya refugees, who are facing a whole other set of challenges.
Yeah, their situation is incredibly precarious. They fled violence in Rakhine State, seeking safety in Bangladesh, but now they're facing the very real threat of forced repatriation.
They're caught between a rock and a hard place. The conditions in the refugee camps are already overcrowded and severely lacking in basic resources like food, healthcare, and protection. And now they're being pushed back to a country where they face persecution and violence.
It's a humanitarian disaster unfolding before our eyes, and the international community seems unable or unwilling to do what's necessary to protect them.
It's a bleak picture, no doubt about it. But before we get too overwhelmed, I want to take a step back and look at what the international community is doing or not doing in response to all of this. What actions are being taken?
Well, there's been condemnation, sanctions imposed on the junta, and humanitarian aid flowing into the country. But there's a glaring problem. There's no real consensus on how to deal with this crisis, especially within the UN Security Council. And that lack of unity is severely limiting the effectiveness of any response.
Right, and the UN Security Council is where the real power lies. There was a recent call to action by the UK Permanent Secretary to the UN, urging the Security Council to take decisive action to protect civilians and ensure humanitarian access. But will it be enough to break the deadlock?
It's a hopeful sign, but it remains to be seen if it will translate into meaningful action. The Security Council has been divided on this issue for far too long, and the people of Myanmar are paying the price for that inaction.
Okay, I need to catch my breath for a second. This is heavy stuff. But I think we're ready to move on to the next part of our deep dive. We're going to look at the resilience of the people of Myanmar, the resistance movement that's gaining ground, and the international efforts to hold the junta accountable. Stick with us because this story is far from over.
You know, it's a testament to the human spirit that even in the face of such darkness, there are these glimmers of hope. The people of Myanmar are not giving up.
It's incredible, isn't it? Their resilience is truly inspiring. Even amidst all this violence and oppression, there's this spirit of resistance that just won't be broken. The junta might be trying to control the narrative, but they're losing their grip.
They are. We're seeing defections within the military, the resistance movement is gaining momentum, and the ethnic armed groups are making significant territorial gains. There was a report recently about 6 soldiers who were forcibly conscripted. They managed to defect to the Donna column. That speaks volumes about the cracks appearing in the junta's facade.
Yeah, it's a sign that their hold on power is weakening. And it's not just happening internally. The international pressure is mounting as well. The ICC's chief prosecutor is seeking an arrest warrant for Min Aung Hlaing, the junta leader, for crimes against humanity committed against the Rohingya.
If that warrant is issued, it will be a major victory for accountability. It sends a powerful message that the world is watching, that those responsible for these atrocities will be held to account.
It's a step towards justice and hopefully a deterrent to further abuses. But let's not forget about the devastating impact this conflict is having on Myanmar's economy. The civil war has crippled industries, prices are skyrocketing, and people are struggling just to survive.
The garment industry, which was a major source of export revenue for Myanmar, is being hit particularly hard. Workers are facing a triple whammy of low wages, rising costs, and the constant threat of being forced into military service. It's a microcosm of the wider economic crisis.
The stories coming out of the garment factories are heartbreaking. Mizzima Weekly described workers skipping meals just to make ends meet and support their families. It's a stark reminder of the human cost of this conflict.
It's a reminder that behind the political machinations and power struggles, there are real people whose lives have been completely upended.
And the junta's attempts to control the narrative are failing. Social media is buzzing with criticism. People are finding ways to speak out, to share their stories, and to challenge the junta's propaganda. There was that explosion at the Tamwe Mayat U Poriati Seminary where the abbot was killed. The cause is still under investigation, but underground guerrilla groups have denied responsibility.
Incidents like that, coupled with the junta's tight control over information, create a breeding ground for speculation and mistrust. It underscores the dangers faced by anyone who dares to question the regime.
The junta's response to all of this has been to double down on control. They've closed all the private banks in Kyaukpyu, which is a strategic port city home to a lot of those Chinese projects we talked about earlier. They're citing security concerns, but it feels more like a desperate attempt to clamp down on the flow of money.
It smacks of paranoia and desperation. Cutting off access to banking services will further cripple the economy and alienate the population. It's a self-defeating move that highlights their increasing isolation both domestically and internationally.
They're trying to project an image of strength, but their actions tell a different story. It's like they're holding on to power by a thread. And then there's the hypocrisy of it all. They're claiming they're going to hold free and fair elections in 2025. They're even talking about inviting international observers. But with all this violence, this censorship, the crackdown on dissent, who in their right mind would believe them?
It's a charade. Their actions completely contradict their words. It's a cynical attempt to legitimize their illegitimate rule.
The General Strike Coordination Body, the GSCB, has called the junta's recent census a complete failure. They're saying that people don't trust the process and haven't cooperated. And there were even reports of attacks on junta officials during the enumeration. It's clear that the people aren't buying what the junta is selling.
The lack of trust is palpable. The junta has lost all credibility and legitimacy in the eyes of the people.
And to make matters worse, they're deepening ties with Russia. Min Aung Hlaing recently met with the governor of Buryatia to discuss expanding cooperation.
This alliance with Russia further isolates the junta on the world stage. It aligns them with a pariah state and puts them on a dangerous path that will only lead to more suffering for the people of Myanmar.
It's like they're clinging to a sinking ship. And it's the people of Myanmar who are being dragged down with them.
That's the tragedy of it all. They're caught in the crossfire of these competing interests, pawns, in a geopolitical game they have no control over.
And let's not forget about the Wa Group, a powerful ethnic armed group that controls a large territory in the east of the country. They recently handed over hundreds of Chinese citizens to China suspected of being involved in online scams. What do you make of that?
It's a fascinating development. It speaks to the complex web of relationships in the region and the Wa Group's desire to maintain good relations with China. They're clearly playing their own game, trying to leverage their position for their own benefit.
It's a reminder that this conflict is not just a simple binary between the junta and the people. There are so many different actors, each with their own agendas and motivations, all vying for power and influence.
It's a complicated puzzle with no easy solutions. But amidst all the complexity, there's one group that's consistently overlooked: the children. The UN has reported that nearly 40% of the 3.4 million people displaced within Myanmar are children.
That's just heartbreaking. Think about the impact this is having on them. They've been robbed of their childhoods, their education, their futures. What kind of world are we leaving for them?
It's a question we should all be asking ourselves. The international community has a moral obligation to do more to protect these children. Their voices need to be heard and their needs need to be met.
And it's not just about displacement. The UN has also reported that the junta has recruited nearly 2,000 child soldiers since the coup. This is a horrific violation of their rights, and it needs to stop.
It's a testament to the junta's brutality and their complete disregard for international law. They're willing to sacrifice anyone and anything to maintain their grip on power.
The National Unity Government, the NUG, has called on the international community to halt the sale of jet fuel to the junta, arguing that it would prevent airstrikes and protect children. It's a powerful appeal. But will it be enough to sway those who prioritize profit over human lives?
That's the million-dollar question. Will the international community finally take meaningful action to protect the most vulnerable in this conflict? Or will they continue to stand by while children are killed and displaced?
It's a sobering thought. Before we get too bogged down in despair, I think it's important to remember that there are people and organizations out there fighting for a better future for Myanmar.
Absolutely. There are countless acts of courage and resilience happening every day. The people of Myanmar are not giving up, and neither should we.
You know, it's easy to get caught up in the big picture of this crisis, but it's the individual stories that really get to me. Like those Myanmar nationals that are in that Indian jail on hunger strike because they're stuck. They serve their time for entering the country illegally, but they can't get released because the Myanmar embassy won't give them the paperwork they need.
It's a bureaucratic nightmare, and sadly, it's not uncommon. These systems are often so slow and inefficient, and it's the most vulnerable who end up falling through the cracks. Their lives are just put on hold, adding another layer of suffering to an already desperate situation.
It's just a stark reminder of how interconnected everything is. We've been talking about the violence, the political maneuvering, the economic collapse, but it all boils down to individual lives being shattered. So what's the takeaway here for our listener? What do we want them to walk away with?
I think the most important thing is to recognize the multifaceted nature of this crisis. It's not just about a brutal military junta clinging to power. It's about China's strategic ambitions, the legacy of landmines, a humanitarian disaster of epic proportions, and a people caught in the middle of it all, fighting for their survival.
It's a complex situation, but understanding those complexities is crucial if we want to be part of the solution.
Exactly. And amidst all the darkness, there are those glimmers of hope. The resistance movement is growing stronger, international pressure is building, and the people of Myanmar, despite everything they've endured, are refusing to be silenced.
Their resilience is truly remarkable. It makes you realize that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can endure.
It's a reminder that we can never give up hope. We need to amplify the voices of the people of Myanmar, support those who are working for peace and justice, and hold those responsible for these atrocities accountable.
And if someone's listening to this and they're feeling overwhelmed, they're feeling like they can't make a difference, what would you say to them?
I would say never underestimate the power of even the smallest action. Educate yourself about what's happening in Myanmar. Talk to your friends and family. Share information on social media. Donate to reputable organizations providing humanitarian aid. Contact your elected officials and urge them to take a stand. Every voice, every action adds to the collective pressure that can ultimately bring about change.
It's about staying engaged, staying informed,
Yeah,
and not turning away from the suffering of others.
precisely. And one way to stay informed is to support independent journalism. Mizzima Weekly, the publication we've been referencing throughout this deep dive, is a fantastic resource. They're doing incredible work, providing on-the-ground reporting and analysis that cuts through the propaganda and gives a voice to the voiceless.
We'll include a link to their website in the show notes so you can subscribe and support their efforts. Every subscription helps them to continue their vital work.
It's crucial to support organizations like Mizzima Weekly that are committed to truth and accountability, especially in times like these.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the crisis in Myanmar. It's a complex and heartbreaking story, but it's one that demands our attention and our action. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you've gained a deeper understanding of the situation and feel empowered to make a difference. Stay informed, stay engaged, and never lose hope.